This is our debate for period 1, intermediate, spring 2024. Our first speaker on the con can begin our public forum debate.
The timer will start on my first word. Corey Lane negates. Result: the United Nations should abolish permanent membership on its Security Council. Contention 1 is Taiwan. First, China won't invade Taiwan now because of lack of statehood. Manning international relations expert wrote in 23. War games suggest a significant risk of escalation. President Xi instructed PLA to be ready by 2027, though CIA Director Burns said that this does not mean China will launch a war. CCP's language is boilerplate, suggesting no new deadlines. The trigger to force unification would be concrete steps by Taipei towards formal independence. Second, lack of veto ensures UN membership. Chung, veteran correspondent, wrote in 21. Global support for Taiwan's participation in the UN has grown strong in recent months. Since the 1990s, Taiwan has sought to join the UN every year with no avail. With US leading countries like Japan and the EU follow offering support, under the UN Charter, it is almost impossible for Taiwan to join the UN, given admission requires approval from the SC, and China has a right to veto. Third, UN membership ensures invasion. Yulin international trade lawyer wrote in 12. The only way to become a state is the UN. Despite de facto separation, China perceives Taiwan as China. Recognition by the UN constitutes grounds for anti-secession law. Fourth, invasion is probable. Tian, Reuters correspondent, wrote in 20. China will attack Taiwan if there's no other way of stopping it from becoming independent. Lee Chief JSD, 2005 law gives legal basis for military action. It is rare for a top-serving military officer to so explicitly make the threat. Finally, invasion kills millions. Kirk, veteran correspondent, wrote in 22. An invasion of Taiwan is a war in which millions could die. Contention 2 is UN stability. First, UN is stable now, but is on the brink of collapse. Warner, Swiss-American political scientist, wrote in 23. The UN remains strong for now, but the UN today appears powerless, but that does not mean it will die. Its agencies function successfully. No one envisages a third from Ethiopia to Ukraine. UN will not suffer the same fate as the League of Nations. Second, UN funding is stable and increasing. Council on Foreign Relations wrote on February 29th. The US contributed $18 billion in 2022, which is one-third of the budget. Biden affirmed that the UN and increased funding, Biden resumed streams that are paused under Trump. As US contributions declined, China boosted its commitments. China is the second largest contributor and increased threshold. Third, lack of veto would end the UN. Yon international law lawyer researcher wrote in 22. Without the veto right, permanent 5 countries simply abandon the UN when their interests conflict. Veto power ensures that they remain within the UN, and veto reduces risk of dissolution, as was the case for League of Nations. Removal paved way for more military interfering with conflicts, and veto may protect UNSC's credibility. If superpowers do not implement a decision by the UNSC, then the credibility of the UNSC will be damaged. If the UNSC enforced UNSC, and the superpower would conflict. This creates a greater risk for international peace than not passing a resolution. Fourth, politically, the only way the veto gets abolished is if the UN also gets abolished. Page, law professor, wrote in 23. Reforming UN Charter is off the table because the Permanent 5 would veto reduction of veto. The only avenue left is to dissolve the UN Charter and form a new treaty that abolishes the veto. The Permanent 5 restrained by the Charter when it suits them is less dangerous than a Permanent 5 that opts out completely, leaving them unrestrained in their aggression. Fifth, without the UN, millions will die. UN's greatest accomplishment is the millions of lives that the UN agency have saved, like the World Food Program, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and UNHCR, deliver life-saving assistance to millions of affected every year. Finally, the UN also provides essential global problem solving. Waste 17 says that problems without passports range from prolific pandemics, terrorism, climate change, mass atrocities, poverty, and the UN system keeps lids on conflict. Eliminated smallpox, delivered life-saving succor in war zones, spawned crucial development and projects. The current World Organization has made substantial contributions. It set broad parameters for international relations. If the UN disappears, we would become fully aware of the escaping hole that we would leave. And thus, we urge you to vote a neg ballot. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Rishi. I'm the first speaker on the affirmative side today, and time will start on my first word. Correlate affirms. Result: the United Nations should abolish permanent membership on the Security Council. Our first contention is North Korea. First, North Korea's slow nuclear missile development is ratcheting up. Grammar Foreign Policy correspondent wrote on April 11th, inching along, North Korea is slowly building up its ability to launch nuclear weapons at a long range, including test launch this month. Jong-un ratcheting up tensions, saying now is time for war. Agree another test is 7th of matter when, not if. With the UN Security Council veto, Moscow last month killed UN panel of experts monitoring for 15 years. Second, past UN sanctions successfully slowed down development. Bugstorm Reuters correspondent wrote in 22, Biden officials concede that sanctions failed to stop, but have at least been effective in slowing down North Korea's nuclear program. UNSC passed multiple resolutions to establish a robust sanctions regime, including coal, iron, lead, textiles, seafood, and oil. Third, Russia's recent veto will end UN sanctions. Arnold Fellow at RUSI wrote on April 3rd, Russia recently vetoed, bringing an end to the world's largest sanction regime. Report incentive for countries to follow through naming and shaming. Without effective monitoring countries have little incentive to implement sanctions robustly. The Security Council has been ineffective at making modest changes, leaving implementation in a state of limbo. Fourth, the veto ensures fast nuclear missile development. The Thomas Professor in 30 years in the State Department wrote on April 11th, Russian and Chinese violations will escalate. The signal will be read by other partners. To extend North Korea moderating its behavior, we can expect the moderation to cease. Finally, fast development causes miscalculation and use, which kills millions. Garsla's 20 years in U.S. Intel wrote in 21, North Korea's nuclear capabilities are advancing rapidly. Increased odds of Pyongyang aggressively leverage weapons for coercion and risk escalation nuclear use. North Korea emboldened make a grave miscalculation, leads to spiraling escalation, eventually nuclear war that results in millions of deaths. Now on to our second contention. Our second contention is atrocities. First, mass atrocities happen now. Kickler director at Simon Center wrote on January 12th, Early Warning Project produced a global risk assessment since 2014. Since we have seen multiple mass atrocities occur, on average, 2 countries experience a new episode each year. A mass killing is 1,000 civilians deliberately killed by armed forces because of their membership. Second, veto power prevents UN peacekeeping. A Stani international refugee expert wrote in 23, in mass atrocities, Security Council has been severely limited in its ability to intervene due to the use or threat of veto. Notable cases include Algeria, Suez, Hungary, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Panama, Iraq, and Georgia. Between 1946 and 2008, the veto was used 261 times. Third, US peacekeeping best decreases atrocities. Walter, world's leading expert on civil wars, wrote in 21. Countries that receive peacekeepers experience less conflict, fewer deaths, killings, longer peace, and fewer repeat wars. This relationship is so consistent across different large analyses that it has strong findings in literature to date that UN intervened in the toughest cases, suggests that studies underestimate the effectiveness. Fourth, independently, veto power prevents expanding peacekeeping and reform. Generic PhD international studies wrote in 09. Peacekeeping reform, few acted on, many too controversial to agree on. P5 ensures peacekeeping is impossible where needed most. Security Council mandates too weak for action. During Bosnia, Security Council was too divided to approve strong action. Their only small force, result was disaster. Finally, expanding UN peacekeeping operations would save 150,000 lives over a decade. Hungary Peace and Conflict Professor wrote Uppsala in 19. We estimate impact of alternate UN policies for 2001-13 period. If the UN invested $200 billion in peacekeeping operations with mandates, major armed conflict would have been reduced up to two-thirds, and 150,000 lives would have been saved. Our empirical approach is more comprehensive than others that restrict the sample. Thus, we strongly affirm. Thank you.
Izzy?
For the app, so you said that expanding peacekeeping saves 150,000 lives over a decade. However, the negative impact is millions of lives a year. So how do you outweigh on that?
So we're not up to weighing yet, but we're not directly saying we outweigh, and also we're not outweigh in magnitude. Also, like they don't have like a specific probability or quantifiable probability that the UN is going to collapse entirely. And then we've already saying that we have the past examples that 150,000 lives have been saved over a decade. So we're not directly saying we outweigh on magnitude, but we also can outweigh on probability. Abiram?
For the app, like, do you have any specific data as to how much sanctions have slowed down nuclear missile development?
Not necessarily, but we're saying like in the past, sanctions have been like really effective in slowing down development, and we have like our second card states all of that. And like if you want, that's it.
Vice?
So adding back to Abiram's question for the app, Can you provide any past examples of sanctions actually slowing down nuclear missile development?
So our second card stated that sanctions have failed to stop, but at least they've been effective in slowing down, keyword slowing down, North Korea's program. And so the UN Security Council passed multiple resolutions to establish a robust sanction regime. So they don't state specific examples, but they've stated that they passed multiple resolutions to establish the sanctions regime.
Arjun?
For the neg.
Yes.
So why does the UN have to get abolished for the veto to get abolished?
Okay, so since when the veto is getting abolished, then since the permanent five is on the veto, when the veto, the resolution comes that the veto should get abolished, then the permanent five will just veto that veto reduction. And we read a card on it.
Before debating about AF or neg, then why do we have to consider the neg possibly not admitting to no veto power?
Because that just means that it's less likely to happen, and that our case is better. Ashish?
How's your case better because how is it better than your opponent's?
Okay, so we said that it's because if the veto gets abolished, then the UN Charter is also getting abolished. Because that we said that the permanent five would just abandon the UN without the veto power. So the veto power is really important, and when the veto gets abolished, then the UN Charter will also get abolished.
Vaish?
So for the neg, you said that the permanent members will just leave, but why would France and the UK leave this since they haven't used their veto power in over 40 years now?
So our card says that the permanent five would abandon when they interests conflict, but the veto is just helping them stay together. Okay, before we start, my name is Allison and I'm the second speaker for the con side. Timer starts on my first word, which is now. Answers to North Korea. 1. Sanctions speed nuclear development. Marsa wrote in April 23 that whenever the U.S. cooked up a new sanction in the UN, it triggered a more powerful and developed nuclear test of the DPRK, Kim said. The pain imposed turned into redoubling determination and will bolster weapon tests. This week, North Korea launched missiles and nuclear drill. 2. No impact. Missile testing is not intentional use, and the risk of miscalculation is denied by the last 70 years of global testing. 3. Evasion inevitable with Russia and Iran. Marissa wrote in April 25 that denounced UN South Korea joint military drills as the reason why tensions are soaring. Russia helped the North Korea evade sanctions through reported oil shipments. In exchange, Pyongyang sends munitions for Ukraine. Lee wrote in April 25 that the Greenfield U.S. ambassador, we will eventually find a mechanism to continue reporting. Russia and China will not stop us from moving forward. An external monitoring body, although new relevant stakeholders such as banks use. 5. No North Korea war. Chung wrote in 23 that nuclear deterrence against North Korea will increase. South Korea and the U.S. will demonstrate various retaliation options. Deterrent work on from movement. North Korea becomes aware of the possibility. SSBN on Peninsula, lowering the possibility preemptive strike. Deployment of possibility of its preemptive strike will undermine secondary strike capabilities. Stealth-induced North Korea prudence. Power projections are not limited by geographical distance, creating mutual deterrence. China and Russia will not tolerate North Korea's program due to the Washington Declaration. Security risks will not be great. 6. North Korea sanctions impose extreme human costs. This completely turns atrocities. Smith wrote in 20 that sanctions did not distinguish between military and civilian energy sanctions, contributed to a precipitous fall in agricultural production, such that the country could not feed a third of 25 million population. UN sanctions did not meet the proportionality. Sanctions failed. Lee wrote in April 25 that China is violating sanctions, illegally importing North Korean coal, hosting hackers, disguised smuggling, hosting money laundering, missiles even parade through streets on Chinese trucks, China harboring Russian cargo ships that transport arms. Also, additionally, sanctions fail because of commitment, evasion, and dependence. And on commitment, Kim wrote on 13 that officials cover up transfers when providing information to investigators. UN sanctions against North Korea have failed because not every country takes sanctions as seriously as the US. Answers to atrocities. Additionally, before we start, I would like to clarify that our UN stability case completely turns their case. Without the UN, we cannot solve their impact, therefore we outweigh. 1. The UNSC will not stop atrocities even without the veto. Leopard Britain 21. Is the Council legally required to act in atrocities? The UN Charter failed to clarify these obligations. What extent duty owns to individuals outside government's control, universal and for all, are legally unspecified. Precise legal obligations are never defined, allowing for a wide spectrum of views. Security Council, including the Permanent Five, adopted widely divergent views, resist Russia and China, they resist calls, the US opposed, and the doctrine itself does not resolve these legal problems. 2. UN interventions are military, which only increases atrocities. Leopard wrote in 21 that governments argue that violations must be stopped by military force. Any R2P interventions that employ military force risk harming or killing other innocent civilians and can set in motion a chain of events that roil in a region, resulting in further human rights violations and atrocities. Post-intervention events in such Iraq and Libya bear witnesses to destabilization. Force unleashed. 3. Peacekeepers immunize evil regimes from revolt. Jet wrote 19 that the country's missions are taking place. Mali, Sudan, and the CAR have governments that corrupt, repressive, and incompetent. 5. UN stability turns its lack of funding means there's no peacekeeping. Ola wrote in 23 that stability is incomplete without a fund. One reason the UN is a victim of its budgeting includes the inefficient payment schedules and borrowing and funding restrictions. Member states do not always pay their bills. This has led to depleted cash reserves, raised on peacekeeping accounts, and ballooning accounts payable. Thus, Judge, we urge you to vote a neck ballot. Thank you.
We're going to be taking writing time. Starting. Alright, we're going to be stopping prompt there. That's 1:30.
My name's Arjun Kumar, and
We took 1:30.
my name's Arjun Kumar, and I'll be the second speaker for the outside. Let me pull up the timer. But my time starts on my, for a quick off-time robot, it'll be their case, and, our case and then their case. So my time starts on my first word. According to Mississippi, and we first collapse on atrocities. First, they said the UNSC won't solve, but the UN peacekeeping best decreases atrocities, and peacekeeping best decreases atrocities. And without peacekeeping, atrocities will still continue. They say that the only way to stop atrocities is military intervention, which still causes atrocities. But we've shown in our constructed that peacekeeping best decreases atrocities, and we have studies and analysis that back up this claim. And they say that peacekeeping immunizes revolt, but do not explain the link between UN peacekeeping and the and them immunizing revolt against corrupt governments in Sudan. And they say that UN peacekeeping is incomplete without any funding, but Germany and Japan fund more than 3 of the permanent 5 members, such as UK, France, and Russia, which will bring up in our rebuttal. And now onto the Taiwan contention. First, we have 3 bottles to the Taiwan contention. 1, they won't get majority for passage even without veto. Trump 21 writes that it is almost impossible for Taiwan to join the UN, given that the majority report from China has 170 diplomatic allies, whereas Taiwan has none. Even if the UN and Japan and the EU raise in a proposal, Beijing can easily rally enough support from the global body to reject the proposal.
2. It is legally impossible. Hale 21 writes that Taiwan is unable to apply under a name like the Republic of Taiwan because of its complex relationship with Beijing. The UN leadership, for its part, seems to have taken Beijing's side for now. It is not legally possible to receive the purported application for membership. And 3. Taiwan is not pushing for UN membership. Chong 21 writes that Taiwan has dropped its old strategy of returning to the United Nations under an official diplomatic name. Instead, it's trying to take part in UN-affiliated organizations. And now, onto the UN stability contention, we have 5 rebuttals. 1. Veto power makes UN collapse inevitable. Chowdhury on February 27th wrote that, with its current cash crisis, UN leadership is finding itself in a helpless situation, both politically and financially. The UN credibility has reached rock bottom. Abusive use of veto power against the global public opinion over the years, more so in recent times, has thrown spanners at all potentially meaningful efforts at the UN. Veto power is not the cornerstone of the United Nations, but in reality, it's tombstone. And 2. The UN collapse is inevitable without reform. Nasu 21 writes that with the rise of China and the resurgence of Russia, there's a renewed prospect for entering into a new Cold War. Moreover, technological advances in the areas such as information and multilateral cooperation and space create a new challenge to security. This dynamic shift in global power balance and the rapid pace of technological advances are likely to pose an existential threat to the United Nations. Political impasse is arising from the Security Council itself. The impasse thus has undermined the Security Council's ability to address international security crisis in recent years. The UN will face a day of reckoning regarding its relevance to contemporary security challenges. And 3. The UN is already in a funding shortfall. ORCHA, February 29th, wrote that the GHO requires $46.10 billion to assess 184 million people in need across 73 different countries. Funding amounts to $4.34 billion, which is 35% less than what was recorded at the same time last year. This funding snapshot is concerning, given the bleak global humanitarian outlook for 2024 and the growing severity of its needs. And 4. Withdrawal is legally impossible. Nelson 17 writes that the United States would have an extraordinarily difficult time leaving the United Nations, and no clear exit path has been created, either through the terms of the United Nations Charter or through the experience of other nations. Unanimous consent is unimaginable. Changes in the circumstance would be weak due to continued membership of the United States throughout many more drastic periods of domestic and international change. In fact, abolishing the veto power encourages other states to increase funding. Grounded 17 writes that Germany and Japan make greater economic contributions than 3 of the 5 permanent members, UK, Russia, and France. These states call for a greater institutional influence and power. The continual exclusion will be a continual source of conflict, if not addressed in the reform of the UNSC. And they also have no link as to how when the veto gets abolished, if the UN gets abolished. And thus, for all of these reasons, we proudly affirm the resolution. Thank you. Rishi.
This is for the con. You guys first said that funding is increasing in reconstructive, but then in your rebuttal, you said that there was a reduced amount of funding.
Yes, because we're saying if you abolish the if we abolish the veto, then the UN, the permanent flag will pull out. Therefore, there will be less funding, and that causes the UN to collapse.
That's the follow.
No. Mike?
Okay, so for the app, so you collapse on your atrocities contention, but they're going to turn in the sanctions for military atrocities. So are you conceding to the fact that sanctions also trigger your impact with atrocities?
We're going to mention that in the summary. Arjun?
So, for the AF, when you guys are like responding to your atrocities convention, like, how are peacekeepers being good, like trigger like military intervention, like not causing atrocities?
Well, peacekeepers are part of the UN military, right? So if and we have data and studies in our contention in our constructed showing that peacekeeping best decreases atrocities. We have 2 cards. Is it?
Are peacekeepers notorious for like increasing atrocities like with like murder and like rape and things? So how are you gonna respond to that? Like,
Well, they haven't brought it up in their rebuttal speech, so Matthew.
This is for the neg. So you guys said how UN interventions are only military, right? And how that only leads to more deaths. But what's your link between UN and military interventions and people dying?
So we're saying that the peacekeeping operations that the UN supports are highly militaristic. So if the peacekeepers come, they're going to cause even more harm and more atrocities, which translates.
This is for the con again. So if there, in your guys' cards, you guys state that there isn't, the UN technically doesn't have a military, it's a peacekeepers, which is what the, pro said. So, if they don't, how is there military intervention if there's no, like, military in the first place? Like, what do the PKOs do
So,
primarily?
in our rebuttal, we read that Call 15 said that the peacekeepers focus on the military component of stopping things, so that's why they're military.
Amir?
Okay, and this is for the pro. So can you explain to me how the UN is collapsed and then vote that reformed?
So, here, let me bring up the card quickly. So, with China and Russia, there's a renewed prospect for a Cold War, and the dynamic shift in global power and the rapid pace of technological advances, which I mentioned in my rebuttal, they'll bring up the collapse of the UN. That's prep time. Not prep.
Okay.
I'll be using those prep next. So I used 2 minutes and 35 seconds of prep. Okay, so first, as an often roadmap, the order will be weighing, and then our case, and then their case. The time will start on my first word. Corey Neg wins this debate because our impact is millions of lives every year, while our opponent's impact is only 15,000 a year. And our opponents collapse on atrocities. However, they didn't respond to our return on atrocities because of how North Korea's sanctions risk human lives, which means they disagree with us, so we turned their case. So extend UN stability. Permanent membership gives the Permanent Five veto power. Without the veto, the Permanent Five will pull out of the UN because it is legally required and will defund it, both and the UN. An imperfect UN is better than no UN, and UN stability outweighs on A, magnitude, because UN organizations provide humanitarian assistance, which saves millions of lives every year, like I already mentioned, and B, causation, because without the UN, we can't pass UNSC resolutions that their contentions rely on, and they won't be able to have peacekeeping operations, which they said that the UN does best. So if we vote for the act, their impact will still happen due to the UN collapsing. So they say that the UN peacekeeping operations are the best, and we have proof that these peacekeeping operations, atrocities will still continue. However, we turn this because without the UNSC, then the peacekeeping operations won't be able to happen, and when the veto is abolished, then there will be no UN at all, so they won't be able to set out these missions. So they say that abolishing veto encourages more funding, but we know that the Permanent Five are the major contributors, and other countries won't be able to fill in this giant gap that the Permanent Five will leave. And they say that veto power makes UN collapse inevitable and that we are in a funding shortfall. However, we mentioned in our constructive that we're not in a funding shortfall because the US has contributed 18 billion, which is 1/3 of the budget, and China has been increasing their funding. And they also said that we have no link and with the veto abolished and the UN abolished. But when the Permanent Five will leave the UN no matter what, and they will find a way to pull out the UN because it's legally required, and then after they pull out of the UN, they will stop funding the UN. And the lack of funding when the Permanent Five leaves means that there will be a collapse of UN and then their peacekeeping operations that their atrocities contention on won't happen. Also, like I mentioned again, we turned atrocities already because of how North Korea sanctions risk human lives, and they didn't respond to us. So it means that they can't collapse on atrocities, but they said that they would respond to it. So they said that that collapsing would also collapse UN credibility. However, it's actually that the veto that's worsening UN credibility, because if the UNSC doesn't pass a resolution based on the Permanent Five, then the UNSC's credibility will collapse and be worse. So now on to their case. They say that atrocities will still be happening if we don't have peacekeeping operations. However, we said that atrocities will be happening either way.
We're gonna be taking 30 seconds of prep starting. Wait. Let me just get the timer out. Oops. Starting now. Alright, Alright, audience, just for a quick off-time roadmap, first we're going to be going over weighing, then we're going to be going over our case and their case. Okay. Judge, in response to our opponent's weighing, they chose magnitude for their weighing. So they said that millions of lives outweighs 150,000 lives for atrocities, but they don't have any probability for this. We actually have a probability that these 150,000 lives are confirmed, and they don't have any probability that these millions of lives are gonna millions of people are gonna die. Again, our impact is happening right now and will happen again. And lack of human intervention because of veto empirically has fueled atrocities in Rwanda, Darfur, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Syria. Okay, Judge, just now on the our case. Just to clarify a question that was asking across. Sanctions do not cause atrocities. Our opponents say that North Korea's sanctions regime cause more and more atrocities, but the sanctions are the monitoring of North Korea's nuclear missile development. This doesn't cause mass killings to happen, which is atrocities. So this argument is dealing. They don't bring up that sanctions cause agricultural failure. However, there's no link between these two. Alright, so extend atrocities. Permanent membership gives the P5 veto power, which historically has been used to prevent UN intervention over atrocities, as well as reforming existing failed PKOs. Extend the Stani 23 to achieve true global peace only by preventing atrocities can we create a world where peace is not perpetually undermined by the gravest international crimes. Now they see that atrocities will happen again either way without through agricultural failure from sanctions. How there's no link, disapproving this argument. Also, the only other rebuttal they extended to our case were the UN stability turn. But again, UN won't collapse because of a lack of veto, which I'm going to explain right now. Judge, now to their case. We're going to be extending our first rebuttal from UN stability. Again, they have no quantifiable impact on how the UNSC is going to collapse. So veto power makes UN collapse inevitable. Extend Charter February 27. With its current cash crisis, UN leadership is finding itself helpless politically and financially. UN's capability has reached our limit. Abusive use of veto against global public opinion over the years have done spatters at all efforts of the UN. Veto power is not the cornerstone of the United Nations, but in reality is its tombstone. They said in response to this card that this card is disapproved because the US is the largest leader in UN funding and China is also funding. But this just again restates the card from their perspective again. This card is from their card was from 2022, and that card doesn't take into account the current cash crisis that is happening right now in 2024 for the UN. Their entire UN stability contention relies on the fact that the P5 will lead, causing its collapse. But extending our rebuttal 5, abolishing veto encourages other states to increase funding. Extend Granja 17. Germany and Japan make greater contributions than 3 of the permanent members, UK, Russia, and France. These states call for greater power. The exclusion will be a continual source of conflict in UNSC. They had no response to this card, so it still stands. Judges and audience, for all the following reasons, we strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Sorry, thank you. Oops. Abiram?
A question for the neg. So, in you guys' summary, you guys said that veto power causes, you said like the veto power will cause the collapse. Isn't that contradicting your own claims?
I said that if we abolish the veto, then the UN will collapse. Sorry. Ashish?
This is for the neg. What's the, do you have any like data or statistics to prove that your millions of lives impact would stand?
Okay, so since we said that abolishing the veto would abolish the UN, and the UN provides this humanitarian assistance, right? So, and humanitarian assistance saves 1 million lives, so that's why it would happen if we abolish the veto. Arjun?
So 2 questions for the neg. 1, why does the UN collapse if the P5 leaves? And 2, why does the UNSC, a small fraction of the UN, collapse the entirety of the UN?
Okay, so basically, your first question was how the veto, like the abolishing the veto would cause the UN to collapse?
Yeah.
Okay, so like we mentioned in our summary that it's like legally required, and also just like the UN like funds, the permanent 5 funds the UN, which would cause that to collapse. Oh yeah, and your second question was
how does the UNSC collapse the entire UN?
because like so.
The UNSC provides humanitarian aid, and that's a very critical part of the UN. So if that fails, then it's going to weaken the international peace, which will weaken the UN.
So for the neg, it's a follow-up to Pranchu's question. In your card, it said that the UN provides humanitarian aid. But now you're switching to the UNSC. So like, how would this really like impact anything? Again, how would it really be impactful? Because your original card said that the UN was the one providing humanitarian assistance, and the UNSC is just 15 out of the main countries.
Okay, so our like original card was how like UN organizations are essentially like the humanitarian aid.
So the UNSC is part of the UN, right? And the UN organizations such as providing humanitarian aid is essential to support all the UN, which includes the UNSC. And yeah.
Question for the neg. So do you take into account the non-permanent 5 members in your argument with UNSC collapsing?
Wait, what do you mean by that?
Do you take into account the non-permanent 5 members, like the members who aren't in the permanent 5 council, like when you make your argument about the UNSC collapsing?
Oh yeah, because the permanent 5 does like the major funding for the UNSC and also.
All right, last question for the pro. Call someone.
Vaish.
Okay, so for the app, so you're in your response to their sanctions terms is that sanctions do not cause atrocities, but they clearly read evidence on how sanctions cause atrocities. So do you have any response to that?
The North Korea sanctions regime is about the monitoring of North Korea's nuclear missile development. That has no link to atrocities at all.
Also,
and
they
how
don't-
it causes
They don't bring
atrocities.
up that if it's North Korea sanctions, they just say sanctions in general just cause agriculture.
And they don't extend
Okay,
it
that
to
is
South Korea.
time.
Okay, I will be taking the last 25 seconds of, yeah, starting now. Okay. Just again, my name is Allison. I'm the second speaker for the next side. And as a quick off-time roadmap, order will be Wang, our case, and then finally their case. Timer starts on my first word, which is now. Correlating con wins debate because our effect is larger and way more likely to happen. Now to our case. To make this easy, let's focus on stability. Extend UN stability. Permanent membership gives the Permanent 5 veto power. And without the veto, the Permanent 5 will pull out of the UN because they will not support majority decisions against them, nor will they fund it. This will end the UN. Additionally, the UN stability outweighs on magnitude because UN organizations provide humanitarian assistance which supports over 1 billion people. B, causation, because UN organizations are essential to solve their impact. Because with the Permanent 5 members, the UN is funded and will continue as a stable organization. And C, probability, because if the UN stops providing humanitarian aid, there is no doubt that people will suffer. Okay, now to our case. They say that we have no link, and if the veto power is abolished, the UN will have to be abolished as well. But the Permanent 5 will find a way to leave the UN. If we have red cards in our constructive and rebuttal that supports this. They say that the UN collapse is inevitable without reform, but as read in our constructive, extend Yacht 22, the lack of veto will end the UN. The veto power is the reason that the Permanent 5 are still in the UN. They say that the other countries that are not Permanent 5 members will fund the UN if the Permanent 5 pull out, but the Permanent 5 are the major contributors, and without them, it will leave a huge hole that even the non-permanent members cannot fill. They say that the lack of veto does not mean the end of the UN, but extend Yacht, without the veto, the UNSC credibility will be damaged, and this creates a greater risk for international peace, therefore weakening the UNSC, causing it to collapse. Now into their case. They say that even without the Permanent 5, the countries will still be funded, but as read in our constructive, without the Permanent 5 members, the UN will collapse because the UN Permanent 5 members are the major contributors to the funding, and without the funding, we cannot provide the peacekeeping operations, and our case completely turns their case. Because without the veto, the Permanent 5 will pull out of the UN, which will defund the UN, and without the money, we cannot provide the peacekeeping operations that their contentions rely on. And that's Judge, we urge a neg vow. Thank you.
Okay, you have 1 minute left. We're gonna take that 1 minute. Starting now. Sorry.
For a quick off-time moment before doing my speech, it'll be Wang's, then our case, and finally their case. So my time begins. My time begins on my first word. When I wins this a bit, many reasons I'll bring up on this speech. First, let me wait. Atrocities outweigh any impact of voting this debate so far because of one key reason: probability. before this, first they say they have a magnitude that is 1 million people, but they have no probability. However, we do. And they also say they have a probability in their summary, but there's no quantifiable link for that. And now into probability. Our impact is happening now and will happen again. And a lack of UN intervention because of veto empirically has fueled atrocities in Rwanda, Darfur, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Syria. Now let's move on to our case. First, let's extend atrocities. Permanent membership gives P5 veto power, which historically has been used to prevent UN intervention over atrocities. And we de-linked the North Korea sanctions turn against atrocities, like we said in a summary, but let me summarize that. They bring up sanctions that cause agricultural failure, however, there's no link between these two. And extend Asani 23, to achieve true global peace, only by preventing atrocities, we can create a world where peace is not perpetually undermined by the gravest international crimes. And they say that atrocities will happen either way through agricultural failures and sanctions. However, there's still, as I said again, there's still no link disproving this argument. The only rebuttal they extend to our case for the UN stability term, but again, the UN won't collapse because of lack of veto. Now let's move into their case. Extending rebuttals. Again, they have no quantifiable impact on how the UN stability is going to collapse. Extend rebuttal 1 from UN stability. The veto power makes UN collapse inevitable. Chowdhury 24 says that in its current cash crisis, the UN leadership is finding itself in helpless situation financially, and the veto is the cornerstone is not the cornerstone of the United Nations, but the tombstone. And they say that this card is disproved because the U.S. is the largest leader in UN funding, and China is also funding, but this just restates the card from their constructive again. This card is from 2022, and as my partner said, this doesn't take account to the crash crisis that is happening right now in 2024. And even and also Germany and Japan fund more than 3 of the P5 members, disproving this argument. And they have not responded to this at all. Their entire UN stability contention relies on the fact that the P5 will leave, causing it to collapse. But extending rebuttal 5.
Alright, that is time.
Yeah.